Welcome. Today I'm going to run through Sockeye Station, a SalmonRun map that was available on release for Splatoon 3 at launch in 2022. I really enjoyed this map on game release, but as time has gone on and as more new maps have been introduced, I've flipped between actively disliking it or just not being interested in playing it at all. I don't think it's a bad map, but I do think there are a lot of small nuances to it that can make it deceptively tricky. So let me give you some advice on how to navigate your way through this map in Freelance. Number 1, the spiral. I feel like we should talk about the spiral in the middle of the map because I feel like it does more harm than good, especially in lower level lobbies. For the newer player, I can see the allure of the spiral. It gives you a place to take a breather, look at what's coming in, and it provides a safe spot for slow weapons to charge their weapon. And I agree with all of these points. I think it's useful when it serves these specific purposes. But when you start to think about the reason you're up there, you need to ask yourself, why are you playing so defensively? The problems, I believe, start to appear when players default to the spiral or camp the spiral for most of the wave, without making an effort to move towards the basket or help with enemies around the basket or either sides of the map. Taking hard defensive positions early on in waves never bodes well for the latter half of the wave. You run the risks of being ineffective as a teammate, stalling bosses on the shore which won't move forward because they're aggroed on you, or causing all the bosses to go to the spiral instead of the basket. In addition, you're forced to throw eggs, which uses ink and time and stops you from firing at enemies, all of which is avoidable if you have eggs around the basket instead. Defensive play, which is when you stop being aggressive with kills and retreat to wait out the clock, is useful when the odds are not in your favour. Think you're a player or two down, or you need a quick breather, or you need space to deploy a special that leaves you vulnerable. If you have no reason to play defensively, then camping the spiral actively harms the flow of the game. As mentioned before, you stall bosses or you force things to move away from the basket. If you're somebody that likes to lure bosses, then you shouldn't be using the spiral to do so. I spend a lot of my time in Freelance stealing lures from players who think taking things to the top of the spiral is useful. This is why I think Sockeye inadvertently teaches bad game sense. It's not immediately obvious that the spiral is detrimental to your game, and like mentioned, it does provide some benefits. But when you're conditioned to react defensively as a natural instinct, you have to ask yourself, how do you expect to pass waves consistently if you're just retreating? So am I saying not to use the spiral at all? Well, not really, because it is useful. If you have a long-range weapon, you can be very effective from the spiral, but you have to remember not to outstay your welcome up there. Your teammates can't help you if you're up there on your own and they're busy around the basket or at different corners of the map. You're also likely not helping them with bosses and letters around the basket, instead being preoccupied with what's spawning on the shore. Lord knows how many times I've been in lobbies with 3 other players all crowding on the top of the spiral and ignoring the letters all over the map. Taking care of incoming drizzlers and quickly taking out stingers on top of the spiral is really useful and something to continue to do, but remaining in one position for a good chunk of time is never advised. SalmonRun feels harder when you're a slower weapon, and that's because you can't afford to remain stationary. Just because the spiral looks safe doesn't mean you should stay there. Number 2, normal tide. Arguably the most difficult of waves, as I think the layout of the map does a disservice to teaching you how to play the game. On the surface it seems quite easy. Basket is at the back of the map, there is a big spiral in the middle to provide high ground and good vantage points, and the map as a whole has paintable walls and ledges that make movement between areas quite smooth. Everything I've already said about the spiral applies to normal tide more than the other waves, so I won't discuss it here too much, but my main bit of advice for this wave is to stay fluid with your positioning, make sure you've painted walls, ledges and paths, and to avoid stalling bosses on the shore or in the corners. As basket is towards the back of the map, you have to learn how to strike a fine balance between luring or clearing areas to avoid becoming overwhelmed. Bosses like lids and steelheads can pose serious issues with mobility and overcrowding on this map, and neglecting several of them in the hope to bring them all closer to basket will often result in chaos. It's hard to determine the skill of your freelance teammates, so I often proceed with caution, especially in lower leveled lobbies. Depending on the comp and the current bosses on the field, sometimes it is quicker to clear an area by shore and collectively throw eggs back to basket. This ensures you're doing something whilst the clock ticks down and not just standing around hoping something will move an inch closer to the basket. This is also really important when dealing with clusters of spawns in either corners of the map. The left side, the one I refer to as the death pit, can take several victims over and over, but ignoring a group of static spawns over there will punish you later on if you can't get there. It's therefore important that you consider what objective is most important to you at that moment. Is it eggs or is it killing? Can you use specials to speed up the process, or do you think some bosses can come closer to basket? If your teammates are repeatedly stalling bosses down there, then the right play would be to help them and clear them ASAP. But it's impossible to give you a right or wrong answer here. SalmonRun is challenging because you're forced to adapt to ever-changing situations. Sockeye really does force you to improve your game sense and make quick decisions about whether you should lure or whether you should kill. Snatchers can be very helpful on normal tide. Given the map size and the different positions bosses spawn in from, you can utilise snatchers effectively on this map more often than you can't. Keep an eye on snatchers early on in the wave. If you think they'll help you, then you can kill bosses early and leave the eggs and run to another corner of the map to deal with other enemies. Just make sure you're there to catch them when they deliver your eggs. And finally, I know this might sound silly as it's an intrinsic part of the game, but do not neglect egg throwing on this map, especially if you're given terrible RNG and are faced with lots of static spawns spread around the map. If you spend the majority of a normal tide wave running around the map to deal with statics and make no effort to throw or deposit eggs along the way, you will struggle to meet quota. Sure, you might think your teammates will do that, but what if they don't? Get into the habit of throwing eggs in the general direction of the basket, as this alone helps a lot with high quota requirements. Number 3, high tide. Sockeye really shines during high tide, as I find it strikes the perfect balance between challenging but rewarding when played well. Like most of the maps on high tide, the key to getting the most out of it, or just surviving it, is to be quick and aggressive with incoming enemies. Gone is the question of whether to lure. Your main focus is staying alive whilst remaining aggressive. You simply do not have the space or time to play too defensively on this wave, and trying to do so will result in worse outcomes. The left side of the map can be tricky to manage. If the majority of your spawns come in from there and the snatchers can't help you, you'll be forced to work with minimal space and water surrounding you. The walls and ledges can be used to help you survive, but a good rule of thumb with this area is to be ready to deploy specials if you're having a difficult time getting through enemies that block the entrances to static spawns behind them. Whale, Inkjet, Inkstrike, Booyah are all quick to use and easily take care of statics. Crab and Kraken are also valuable here, but require strategic movement and positioning to pull off, which might not be possible if the map is overrun with spawns. Eels, lids, steelheads and fish sticks are probably the most oppressive bosses to have on this wave, and neglecting any of them for too long will result in loss of turf and loss of movement. If you factor in all the lessers that swarm around you too, then it's likely GG's if you're not fast enough. It's important not to leave bosses that restrict space alive too long, as inability to move generally leads to inability to recover ink and potential death. Steelheads are excellent at creating explosions around them that destroy lessers, other bosses, and it creates turf. The same goes for lids when you're able to utilise them well, but it's important to not leave them alive too long, as the lessers they spawn can be overwhelming and you don't have much breathing room on high tide. The spiral can provide a good position for longer range or slower weapons, and given the smaller scale of the map for high tide, you can use this to your advantage more than you can for normal tides. Flyfish, sticks, stingers and lids can be reached easier from the top of the spiral, and you don't run the risk of stalling bosses as much as you do during normal tides. I tend to avoid the spiral if I'm a lightweight or short-range weapon, like a fast shooter, as I find I'm more effective running around the map and playing around basket. However, it's not terrible to position yourself here to take advantage of the height if you need it. You'll likely see freelancers who have slower weapons take a position up on the spiral, so there is no need to be up there with them if they're managing fine. Know your weapon roles and know where you're most effective. Number 4, low tide. Low tide is fairly straightforward and shares a lot of similarities with other low tides such as Marinas Bay, Spawning Grounds and Gonefish and Hydroplant. The longer and flatter layout of the map means you won't be able to use higher ground or play defensively without good cause. You have good options to lure here when you're able to, and oppressive bosses such as lids and eels don't restrict movement around the map like they do in other tides. The thin walkways can pose difficulties if congested, but simply backing away will let bosses pass through these choke points and allow you to kill them easily and run the eggs quicker. However, I often go by the rule that if a steelhead is activated and it starts its attack cycle, I will kill it then and there to avoid it taking up too much space or wasting too much time. It's hard to coordinate luring in Freelance, and all it takes is one person who isn't aware of the game plan. If that's what's happening, move forward and take out bosses with them instead of hanging back. Specials like Inkjet, Crab, Whale and Ink Strike are really effective here, as you have few obstacles that interfere with the way you use them. Kraken, Splashdown, Booyah, Wavebreaker and Reef also benefit from their layout, as a lack of grates or ledges means you can use them to maximum effect. Use specials proactively on low tide. I often find players find it difficult to get to statics at the back or choose to not prioritise them, as they can be avoided with movement around the map. However, I promise you, having multiple statics on the field will make it a real struggle at the basket. Take either the left or the right routes to the back of the map. It's quicker and you have a bit of safety to back out if needed. Number 5, Night Waves. So for the Night Waves, I'll keep it brief. Mothership, Mudmouse and Sea King are all relatively straightforward. Longer range weapons should definitely use the spiral to their advantage during Mothership, and during Mudmouse and Sea King, you should definitely keep an eye on Snatchers to see if they can help with far eggs. Fog and Cohawk Charge can feel tricky if things get overwhelming, so for Freelance I'd recommend being proactive and avoid stalling bosses or overluring, especially if you have weaker or slower weapons. I almost forgot Tornado, but yeah, it's Tornado, it's not tricky. Like most maps, I assume the main issues people have are with Rush and Grillers. I have made 2 comprehensive videos on Rush and I talk about Sockeye in depth, so I won't repeat what I say there here. I'd really recommend watching it, as I explain why positioning yourself at basket is more optimal than wall clinging or using the spiral for the majority of the time. The only time I'd suggest wall clinging or using the spiral to stall is when you want to play defensively. The same can be more or less said for Grillers, although I feel the mode is less intuitive than Rush. These wave types can be really intense at higher hazards and during high tides, so you need to be prepared to burn specials, but also be very proactive with slaying. With Grillers, you want to lure them towards the basket, all for the same reasons I've said before. But given that during Grillers you do have some downtime, it could be played more defensively if you feel like your team is struggling, and luring them away towards a spiral might be something that needs to be done, either for safety or so your team can run some eggs quickly. Whichever way you play Grillers and Rush, just remember that the raised platformer basket is very helpful in dodging attacks and rerouting enemies, which can honestly be life-saving at times. Like everything else in SalmonRun, you need to be flexible and adapt to the situation unfolding in front of you. Remember that during Freelance, your main goal is surviving and meeting quota. So even though I generally recommend not playing defensively where you can, I understand that sometimes it's the only way you'll pass. I also just want to add this: after I've written the whole script and edited the whole video, I realised I didn't really talk about big shots, but be super conscientious of the fact that people will camp big shot cannons on this map, given how far away they are from basket. If you see big shots that are not being attended to, go and defeat the big shots, of course, but be careful of spending too much time there. You will notice that people will come and help you instead of running eggs, and more often than not I've been the person defeating big shots far away from basket and noticing that nobody is depositing the eggs that I'm launching back to basket. So you need to make smart decisions regarding if you're going to go down to the big shot cannon, or if you feel like your teammates down there are doing a good enough job that you can leave them and you can go deposit those eggs. It's not like other maps where the distance to the big shot cannon is smaller or, not as far. So if you die down at the big shot cannon behind the spiral or in the bottom left hand pit, the death pit, then you're going to have a really hard time, A, doing anything constructive, and B, being able to get back to your teammates who might be desperately trying to reach quota. So like everything else in SalmonRun, you should stay fluid. You shouldn't camp one area. It's Freelance, just remember that. You're not overfishing, guys. Come back to basket and help run the eggs, okay? Thanks, bye. I hope this video helps in your Freelance journey. Let me know what you think. Now you know how to play Sockeye, find out how to play Rush on it by watching this video. I'll see you guys soon.